Welcome to the Playlist Podcast, where we talk to artists, coders, designers, engineers, athletes, musicians, authors, all kinds of people from all walks of life to uncover a little bit about them and the video games that influenced them along the way. I'm Benjamin Dorr, this is Playlist Episode 2, and today we're hanging out with Guy Walshe, experienced design director at the 3000s. Guy has had some incredible experiences working for studios like Ubisoft, Blue Tongue, and also Ghost Story Games as well. I think what's really interesting about this conversation is Guy's perspective on storytelling and how UX really works in games. He's definitely had a variety of experiences and he's been influenced by games along the way that have, led him to some really interesting perspectives. Just a note, I was losing my voice a little bit through this podcast, so if I sound husky, just know that I was battling through. All right, let's jump in. What is experience design from your perspective?
I think it's definitely an evolving thing. When I started out in this industry, the term UI designer barely existed. And it's only like as it's progressed that UI has kind of defined itself a little bit more, obviously. But then alongside that, this separate beast of its whole different discipline, UX and user experiences has come about. And even that in itself, between different studios and different companies, it can mean different things. But for me personally, it kind of goes back to some of the core original principles of being a designer, like good graphic design or any design is solving a problem or fulfilling a need for a user or a reviewer. It's just that applied on a much on an interactive scale relating to games. So all the most of the UX stuff now, I feel you can draw the direct lines of assessing users' needs and testing stuff, and all that stuff was good design back originally. But now it's kind of been focused on, okay, how can we use that for an actual interactive experience? So I think it's nothing new at its core, but then it is something new because the technology and the experiences are much more whole, complete, complex. So all that sort of thinking that would have gone into maybe a poster in the 70s or 80s, you're applying that same thinking on, okay, this is the intro screen, and the intro screen goes into this menu and these icons and these transitions, and how is that going to work together, and then how is the whole game going to progress? So it's grown a lot. So in my head, I try not to define it because it is always changing, but it is at its simplest, it's just fulfilling the needs of the user in an elegant kind of way that's complementary to what you're creating.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that through line that you mentioned with graphic design and seeing those steps, because great graphic design is also about, evoking a feeling or speaking to an audience on a sub level to make them feel the same way. And I think, UI and game experiences have got to subtly evoke feelings through aesthetic, through placement, through sound that, make you want to come back or make you want to kind of revel in the space. And you get those really beautiful experiences like Monument Valley experience, or there's great platformer Gris, that had that kind of watercolor feel, and everything is done with intent and everything evokes a feeling and flows from one place to another, and then I think with contemporary gaming, it's probably kind of more mobile gaming, but the idea of the experience leading you in a loop or a direction, or it's a really fascinating kind of space. but I also know, obviously your background in history, which you're going to dive into. And I think it's interesting that you've led to that experience space as well. Where do you want to start? Should we talk about Hong Kong?
Yeah, yeah, probably. That's where yeah, where it all started, I guess, for me as games. Yeah. So yeah, in short, my father worked in the airlines, worked for Cathay Pacific. So that meant at a young age, just prior to school, we moved from Australia to Hong Kong. Um, and as a kid, around that time, it was a good time to be in that space because there was a lot, huge access to a lot of technology for fairly affordable prices. But I also, for whatever reason, I wasn't one of those kids who did a good job of like making a case to my parents of like, oh, I need this this game system or this thing. So we didn't really have. I think the first systems I ever had access to, was like the original NES that was left behind by like an exchange student who stayed with my grandparents one time, and um, I played that a little bit on holidays, but the first system that really belonged to me was a one of the original Game Boys, and I only got it because it was I think it was we had a dinner party. I would have been like 7 or yeah, around 7 at the time, and it was a gift from our landlord's son who'd just come back from South Korea and brought, like, incredibly generous, like, just here, have a Game Boy for your snotty little 7-year-old son. Um, but yeah, he gave me that, and it had like I think it came with Mario. But then I think the game that really defined it for me was just the I always forget. Oh yeah, it's Fall Turtles, the Turtles one, Fall of the Foot Clan. Um, and that was only because the game itself is nothing amazing. Like it's a standard platformer, like your typical sort of like combat, like one hit combat. Most things just explode straight away. You're moving back and forth. Um, the music was fantastic. I was a huge Turtles fan at the time. That was great. But the experience that really locked it in for me was, and this is one which I doubt most people had, because I was in Hong Kong, because almost every second kid had a Game Boy, and because our school was literally just one big concrete basketball court. So imagine at lunchtime, you have like 600 plus kids just emptied into this one big basketball court. There wasn't room for running. There was like a few girls playing jump rope, but then it was like a prison yard. But then there was a row of kids who would just have their Game Boys and the connection cables. And so we were playing multiplayer Turtles at lunchtime. And that was like literally my first sort of like game experience, and just having your friends play with you. Not having to go to their house, like being able to do it at lunchtime. It was really fun, and it worked so well as far as like you had the 4 different turtles and you had the different lives and you could swap between it, and everyone had this perception of which turtle was better or which one had the better reach. And I think they all still had, actually no, I did watch a video. They did have slightly different hitboxes, so there was something to it. But at the time, it was just like this magical kind of like multiplayer experience, years before I ever kind of like could replicate that again. Especially before you could have couch co-op all the time. So no, it was a really cool experience, and yeah, I think that's what made it really special for me.
Do you have who's your favorite turtle, or who was your favorite turtle at the time, and has that turtle endured, grown with you?
Yeah, it's very telling. I was always a Raph fan, but I was a very moody emo kid, and I worry because my oldest is also a big Raphael fan. But then from a mechanics perspective, I always felt safe as playing Donatello. So yeah.
Raph is also my favorite. I want to put that out there, and my kids love turtles. Yeah, it's amazing, like as an IP, how much that has endured over decades and decades. And and just it hasn't. I mean, it's evolved and refined and been reborn, but it hasn't really lost its essence. Like it's kind of kept its, you know,
Yeah, yeah. And I think it doesn't feel like the fact that my kids just naturally got into it and they got into a whole different entry point. I think for them, they chose the 2012 Turtles. That was like the show that kicked it off for them. Um, uh, but it doesn't feel strained. Like some of those old IPs, you feel like they're flogging the dead horse and they're getting it out, and you're like, oh, it's not quite what it was. But every time Turtles comes out, it seems to capture a new generation again and again, and it feels fresh for them. So yeah, I think it's pretty special in that kind of way.
coming to the Gold Coast. I can imagine there would have been a huge culture clash for you because, you know, you're growing up in Hong Kong and it's vastly different culturally. Did you have a period where you obviously had the British accent and you had a little bit of room to move, but what was that adjustment like? Like,
Yeah, yeah, it was definitely culture shock. And I didn't last at that school. I found my fellow nerds pretty quick. Um, and and it was yeah, it to make matters worse, it was an all boys school. It was not the space. I think I left it beginning of year nine. Um, and we moved to a different one in Brisbane. But yeah, it was a huge culture shock. I came back. I was the second shortest kid in my grade. I had a British accent. I was into video games. Um, yeah, it took a little while for me to catch up and find my social space, but it all worked out in the end. Yeah.
and you know, so you've got the Game Boy. Did you, you know, level up with a new console? Like, what was that kind of next hardware step?
Yeah, so yeah, it was actually that was soon after I came back. And I think I'd seen it. I loved watching the Attract videos you used to see back then of like you'd be in a game store and they just have the system plugged in, and you even if you couldn't play it, you could watch it like doing the intro sort of like main menu Attract screen. And I was obsessed with watching the all the old Sonic Mega Drive stuff, and for whatever reason in my head, I'd had Nintendo. I'd inherited that NES and then had the my own Game Boy. And then but I was like, no, I was really into this whole Sega thing and captivated by that. So my next system was I bought a Mega Drive when I came back to Australia, but I still had access to um we'd visit Hong Kong from time to time. So I still had access to a huge library of Mega Drive games. Um, and through that, I had this one game that me and my brother got really, really into. And I bring it up. It was called Rocket Knight Adventures. Um, and it had links to, I think one of the designers worked on Contra. Um, but I just really loved it. It was kind of like almost like a weird, you're a possum. There was like a weird steampunk aesthetic to it. The enemies you were fighting were like Nazi pigs. Like it was really, it was an out of the box kind of game. And had like some interesting jet propulsion mechanics and a lot of people never really played it. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, the version I played was based off the Japanese release. And there was a whole, they basically re-edited that version and did like different cutscenes to release it in North America. And I've since gone back and played it, and it lost a lot of the charm. And I think it was one of those things where they thought, oh, this is just too zany and it's not going to read for the US audience. But I wonder if that kind of like, yeah, took away some of its chances of succeeding. But no, I really, really enjoyed that game. It just had such variety of like levels and like had these interesting boss fights. It was by no means a perfect game. Like I'm not going to try and compare it to a Mario or something like that on a game design level, but from the world that it evoked and the visuals, it just did some really nice, interesting things. And I don't think enough, I very rarely hear it brought up, but that's like, literally, if you think of, for me, if I think back to like console icons as a kid, there's like Mario, Sonic, and then there's Sparkster from Rocket Knight Adventures. Like I just really like the character design and the whole world he was a part of. So yeah.
He does look like a kangaroo. Like he does not look like a possum. You got confusing, like, but you're right about the steampunk element. Like he's got goggles, he's got the kind of whole, he's definitely got a vibe. And it was the era of the mascot hero driven.
Yeah. Everyone, and you could tell like, yeah, Nintendo had their crew, and it was like that. Sega were trying to like form their Avengers of like, okay, we've got Sonic, he's doing well, and they were looking for other icons. This was a Konami game, but it was definitely yeah, it was that of that era of like, we need a mascot, we need an idea. But there was a few different iterations too, and like some were direct sequels, but I never found. I went back and played some of the others later, and they didn't quite hit the same way the first one did. But like everything from music and visuals and yeah, there were levels in it that were basically like side scrolling bullet hell situations, which was just really, it was an interesting combination of mechanics for a platform heavy game that you didn't really see in many other ones. So yeah, it was a special one.
This might be controversial to say, but I do think, at that period of Sega and Nintendo, I mean, Sega was much more of the risk taker, in terms of going in weird spaces.
Yeah.
Even though Nintendo pushed in the ambition and, had, a lot of bold choices, like Sega went weird.
Yeah.
And there's a whole spate of games which are quite crazy. And I think that's also reflected in, how Sega presented themselves, like in North America, and that whole, there's that great book, Console Wars, which talks about that in the birth of Sonic and, the rivalry with Nintendo, but also the tactics to position themselves as the other, it's a pretty fascinating book.
Yeah. It's funny too, looking back, like the arguments we had then back at school. I do remember that back on the Gold Coast, there was kids who were arguing about like color count between the Super NES versus Mega Drive, and it was all the groundwork was being laid for all the console arguments that would happen for like the next 20 years. Like I think it's only now that like I've actually heard my children in relation, they were talking about like the Switch 2 and a few other things, and I've actually heard kids say, oh, the graphics are good enough now. Like it's kind of, I think we've hit that point where we kind of realize that like the Switch has proved that you can have amazing gameplay and it doesn't need to be like cutting edge like tech to warrant it, and you can have cutting edge tech and still have gameplay that sucks. So I think I hopefully think we're at a point where we're kind of like tech agnostic and we can focus more on the quality of the games. But back then it was like still the very early days of like, my game has more pixels than your game, or that sort of thing. But yeah.
I also think like looking at the PS5 Pro versus the PS5, and it's such a minor, obviously there's a market for it, but it's such a minor difference. And then on the Xbox side of Xbox kind of being everywhere and moving away from the console, it does feel that we have reached this point of, I mean, you can definitely push things up, and probably from a kid's point of view, like they might have brand loyalty. My son is a PlayStation guy and refuses to play Xbox, but it really is like this point of the evolution is, it's run its cycle for now until someone does something that's.
Yeah. Now it's more that it's probably that the borders are more where your friends are locked in, and that's kind of going to be the thing that helps most people make their decisions going forward. So it's almost that, I guess, which is what a lot of the companies want. They want to basically be a social network, and that's the garden within your friends are. So that's where you'll stay. But that being said, like crossplay now is amazing. Like the fact that I can play PC with my son while he's on PS5, like, yeah, I hope that doesn't go away. that just needs to get stronger. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the metaverse kind of is realized in that space, right? But it's just through a variety of different spaces and different areas. It's just not in the one holistic space.
Yeah, the other thing, I think we're getting the next game that comes up. So while I was in that sort of like alienated space on the Gold Coast, didn't really have my people yet. When I did start to meet people, um, it was just pre-internet. So I don't think we actually had access. Like it was one of from the Gold Coast. It was not a local call. So you were gonna, if you did have it, you'd be paying by the minute. The closest servers were in Brisbane. And so to sort of like fill in that gap, a lot of my friends it was in the days of BBSs. So this was online bulletin boards. Um, for those who don't understand, you'd have the phone line that kind of came into your house. Um, for me, I was just a poor kid, so I just had one phone line. But so if I wanted to connect to a BBS, it would be through uh, my modem. No one in my house could use the phone. If they did, they picked it up, I'd cut whatever I was accessing. Some of these kids who I was friends with, they had like their parents had multiple lines, so they could have a dedicated BBS that would run like 24 hours a day that other kids at school could dial into and connect to. And some would support multiple users at once. And it became like a kind of badge of honor where kids would like hand out their exclusive club, like, here, you can come play in my BBS. Um, and interestingly enough, when I look back on it, that was probably the first place I got the idea of doing computer art before I even realized that was going to be what I did. Because as you connected to these BBSs, it was all very primitive ASCII art, but it would like each kid would have their own customized wall of images that would scroll down, and sometimes it would be just complete fan art of whatever video games they liked, Sonic or whatever it was. And other ones might be like all fantasy themed and stuff. But one of the games on the message board was Legend of the Red Dragon, and that was a fantasy themed text base, mostly text. I think there was a few little visual screens that would pop up. Game where you could log on and do fantasy sort of things like walk around the world and fight things, go on adventures, there was a bar that you could go into, and basically it could either work asynchronously or I think you could even have multiple people in there at once, so you could chat to other people. And it was pretty primitive, but at the time it was like you'd see every time you connected, you'd see a kill count of like who died or who did what since you last logged on. And so there was a competitive nature to it, and you'd sort of there'd be like stories would start to emerge of like, because everyone had aliases, so it's like, Ragnar the Great just killed this person and did this thing, and you'd be trying to figure out who it was at school who was like Ragnar the Great. Yeah, it was a really cool preview of the internet before I was ever exposed to the internet. And it was kind of in that nice sort of safe phase of it was only people I knew. There wasn't really any strangers there. And because of the ASCII art and stuff, I started mucking around, sending my friends scripts of like, here, I made this. I figured out how to type this out. And that was probably my first exposure to design stuff. And you could put some of that stuff into the game as messages you'd send people. And yeah, it was pretty much like my first RPG exposure. And even though the graphics were so primitive, the fact that it was so text-based, in my memories of it are so much richer because I'm remembering that, like, I fill in all the gaps, and it's like an interactive book I played with my friends. Whereas when I actually go back and look at what I was staring at, it's not nearly what the pictures in my memory are. But no, it was an interesting experience.
But what you're describing is purity, right? Like,
Yeah.
that there's no noise around it, or there's no bad intent, or there's no bloat, or there's no, like, in its purest form, it's just stripped down. And it's so interesting to look at those early internet experiences and the interactions you had and the things you played versus now, after this evolution. I mean, it's such a vastly different
Yeah. Yeah.
interaction,
Yeah. I
that
don't want to, it's hard not to do, like, I don't want to be like a kids these days, but there was something special about the fact that there was anonymity, but it was anonymity amongst people I knew. So it was kind of a safe selection. And you had that in the back of your mind. And no one really abused that. Like, no one was really griefing anyone. Everyone was trying to help people. That quickly changed in the early days of the internet. But no, it's something I'd like to recreate for my kids currently. Like, just recently I put together like a Minecraft server for them. And they're inviting their friends locally, and I'm doing it almost out of trying to recreate that experience I had as a kid, where I had a virtual place I could play with my friends, create things, share things, but then it was also safe, and you didn't have to worry about other randoms dropping in and all that sort of stuff.
I mean, I think, Minecraft servers, like you setting up your own server is a perfect digital safe space, because as a parent, there's so much paranoia around Roblox and interactions, and also having like your kids play with their friends in Fortnite, and then there's a disagreement about what happened in the game, and then that drama spills into real life, and then you suddenly realize kids do not divide what happens in digital spaces and real life. I've noticed with my kids, it's the same thing, right? They don't go, oh, this is just a game. And so, yeah, I think the ability to do that and have that sense of enclosure and safety and simplicity is really important.
Yeah, that being said, I've almost been reduced to tears when the kids have destroyed my creations in Minecraft before. So yeah, we're still looking into how we lock down the rules of who can edit what and when. Yeah, it's almost worse than real life.
Did you kind of stay in the PC space, like after you kind of had the early kind of message board days? Did you stick with PC as your preferred platform?
Yeah, it probably, I think from when soon after I left the Gold Coast, I think I bought another PC just after that. And yeah, I did deep dive on PC. I don't think it was until later when my brother got really excited about when the first Xbox came out. I didn't buy anything in between. It was all PC games in that section. And yeah, I played. I've never been one person that sort of like has, oh, this is my genre. Like, I'll play everything, and then this list probably goes through some weird, really random tangents, like known ones and unknown ones. But I always had a penchant for sci-fi and like space sci-fi, and like I really like the all those X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, all those sorts of games. But the one game that really sort of like captured my imagination on like in the same way that fantasy games did at the time was a game called Solar Winds. And it's also one that looks a little primitive when you look back at it. And I think it was one of the ones I played it as like a demo first, and then got access to the full game later on. But it was like a top-down, completely 2D, and you're just moving around through XY coordinates, basic sort of flying, like there was slight combat stuff to it, but most of it was kind of like strafing in a circle and trying to shoot. But most of it was exploring this solar system, and finding these like little side quests and just emergent sort of stories that you come across. And I think it was for quite a primitive game, it had enough richness in this world that it felt like and anything was possible. Like it felt like I could just pick a direction, I could fly for half an hour, and I could find some crazy sort of side quest thing that would pop up, and it. I was probably near the bounds of the game, or it was going to loop at that stage. But at the time, it just felt like it was infinite. Like it felt like I could just fly anywhere, and later on, you got like special jump boost and all that sort of stuff, like different ways to get around, and there was factions, and yeah, it was a really, I don't think it's one of those games that wasn't so much what it was, but it was the ideas that it gave me of what it could be. Really planted the seed for like games that I still don't think have fully delivered today. Like every now and then I'll go into a space sim, and I'm always slightly disappointed that it's not quite what I'm after, whatever that itch is I want to scratch. But I think when I look back at this and what I really enjoyed about this, it was just the story and the ideas that were weaved into it. And strangely enough, SolarWinds was it wasn't early Epic Games. Let me just bring up the wiki. I think it was an early Epic. Yeah, Epic Games. So this was like 1993. Yeah, multi-directional shooter. So who knows if this was the hit? Yeah, and then this could have been the direction of Fortnite. But no, as it was, this was, I think, a couple of years before Epic really found their stride.
You brought up a really interesting point, because I think it's something that's like universal to people who enjoy games or movies or even music, but it's the idea of chasing the dragon. So, you had a really great experience with a piece of media when you're a kid, and it might be other things around that. And then you keep visiting things in that genre for years and years, trying to recapture the feeling you had when you had the first experience with a piece of media. I do that with horror movies. Like, I had some great early experiences with horror movies, and then I've watched a ton of terrible horror movies to chasing the dragon, trying to get the experience back. Would you say that, like, with SolarWinds is like No Man's Sky or even Mass Effect, is that kind of the thing, or Star Citizen, that you felt it was a precursor to?
Yeah, no, it's been because I've got, yeah, definitely those ones. Each time those ones were proposed, I'd be like, oh, this is what I want. This is what I want. But then I go into No Man's Sky, and it's not quite curated enough. Like there's not enough of a through line of these stories actually make sense or need to be there. It's more just incidental. And then you have like what was the other one you made, the Obsidian one? Not Obsidian. You mentioned it. Sorry. Star Citizen. Yeah, every single game I've played has like captured one aspect, but not quite that whole thing. And it almost makes it's one of those things deep down. I'm like, I want to make I want to combine the story of like the richness of storytelling from like Disco Elysium and like a whole bunch of the what was the other one, Outer Worlds. That I wanted something with that storytelling, but then I didn't even need all the fidelity of the flying around the universe and all that sort of thing. Like I'd be very, very happy for someone just to put like all the bells and whistles of modern storytelling into just a top-down 2D space game. And I think that would be closer to giving me what I want than trying to add all those other functioning systems. Because at the end of the day, yeah, you can just show me a little graphic of like you're descending to the planet. Like it doesn't have to be high fidelity. I'll fill in the idea.
That's a great point about games and storytelling, of giving your imagination space to breathe and getting the essentials so you can be immersed without overwhelming the player in immersion, if that makes sense.
Yeah. The show don't tell, that kind of experience. There's a lot of there's I think some of the modern games, they're trying to sort of like, they have to get a little bit handholdy, and a lot of this does come back to it's a balancing act for how alienating you want the experience to be. Like if there's games I've worked on, and there's games I'm probably going to mention in this list that going back are like, oh, it's so handholdy. Like the actual design at the time wasn't as mature, where they're like, oh, well, rather than directly tell you this, we'll construct a really well thought out tutorial level where you have to do the things. No, it was back in the eras where it's just like, okay, your intro to this game is literally going to be pressing through like 20 different prompts of how to do things, and then you actually, like 10 minutes later, you get to play the game. Whereas I think nowadays, overall, we've got a much higher expectation of how those intro experiences and just general game experiences go. And that is something that yeah, we've at least progressed in. There may be other things we've kind of forgotten or maybe don't take as seriously, but that area, yeah, give me modern experiences, but with I think original ideas. That's what I'm after.
Yeah. Are you a big sci-fi person in other media as well?
Yeah, but I think I'm picky with my sci-fi. Like there's certain, it's funny what will turn me off. Like I need to go back and watch The Expanse. Like from everyone who's told me there's so many good things in that, but the guy's wardrobe, like his fedora in like that made me check out. And yeah, I shouldn't have, but that was like, there's weird little things like that if there's some part of the world building that I don't 100, which is ridiculous in a show that's completely fantasy. But yeah, that can kind of like pull me out of it, and I don't get into it as much.
Yeah. I think that's called creative decision ick, because I've also tried to watch The Expanse and I also got distracted by the fedora. And if there's something that pulls you out of the experience immediately that you can't, maybe it's a personality thing, but
Yeah,
100%.
I've heard so many good things about it though, so I think I will get back into it at some stage. But yeah, I really loved I really enjoyed Battlestar Galactica, like the newer series, or what, it's weird saying the newest series when it was like early 2000s, but yeah, the remake, the original remake. Um, yeah, for all the foibles that people have with the ending and stuff, like there was some uh, amazing stretches of storytelling in that. Yeah, and just the world building. Like I liked that. I believed a lot of aspects of that world and the war with the Cylons and the reliance on analog equipment versus digital stuff. Like there was a lot of things there that didn't have to be perfect, but it was enough that I kind of respected the calls that they'd made. Yeah.
And I think what was good about the reboot or the extension was the ambition. Like I like ambitious sci-fi that has ideas in it. And I think, taking it from where it started and really extrapolating that and giving it real weight was pretty clever and daring for the time. Because I mean, that's got to be like at least 15 years old now.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah. No, it's yeah. Lots of people have. I'm just thinking a lot of those actors look totally different now and different things. But yeah. No, it was a good experience at the time. I remember watching that. That was coincided with me starting in the games industry, and actually, yeah, a lot of the games we're mentioning now are all pre me being in the industry or even thinking that was possible. So yeah, I think the next one was on the original Xbox. And the original Xbox, people will think of like all the sort of classic Xbox games, like you got your original Splinter Cell, you got your Halo. This was a game that almost barely anyone knows of, and it's called Phantom Crash. And it on paper, like the cover looks like sort of generic, weird, more sort of like utilitarian mech combat. But the the actual game itself, I think the cover didn't really sell the quirk of the game, because within the game, you've got like these cool stylized characters. All the mechs have basically a controller chip that's tied to an animal. So you're upgrading. It's almost like you have a pet inside your mech, and some of them, they'll all be everything from like a rabbit to a bird to a dog. And you have this weird relationship with your mech where you upgrade it and you buy and sell parts. It has a, speaking of like convoluted, handholdy mechanics, there is so much text in this game, like in between what is basically just mech battles and upgrading and buying parts for your mech. There's a huge story that I've got no idea what it actually is, because I just skipped straight. It was just, I love the art, I love the worlds, but like it was just so much. It went through like, there was relationships between different characters, all sorts of stuff. And I think a lot of it fought directly with what other people were trying to get out of the game. So I wonder how much that kind of harmed, like pushing other people away from it. But respect to them for like, they swung big in multiple directions. And the mechanics of it were really cool. Like from a high speed sort of mech combat shooter, it had really interesting, it was one of the first games from a UI perspective where the UI would kind of track to the camera and actually helped accentuate a lot of the maneuvers and stuff the vehicles would do. All these sorts of tropes that really got used a lot in like the 360 generation, or towards the end of the 360, but like this was early Xbox, and I don't think enough people give it credit for what it did at the time.
Mm. Who was the developer of Phantom Crash?
Genki was the developer. Encore Games. Yeah, so this was 2002. This was towards the end of the Xbox era, but it was really, it was quite technically interesting. Like I think it holds up a lot more compared to a lot of those other mech games of the era. Like you go back and play like the original Mech Warrior, and it is really, really dated. And even those other ones that were very slow and tank-like, like Steel Battalion, this is completely in the other direction as far as being like fast-paced. You're basically flying / sliding around these levels and jet jumping and much more. The combat is much closer to what I ever would have wanted from like a Macross Robotech kind of game. But it was just a slightly different aesthetic. But it was a really cool game. And I think it spoke right to my sci-fi nerd core.
You mentioned, starting your games career around this period. What is your break-in story? Like, how did you first break into the games industry?
I wanted to try and do a career related to art, because that was the one thing I didn't hate in school. And luckily my mom kind of did the math of like, okay, these are the things you're good at and these are the things you like. You'd probably like graphic design, and here's a course you should probably do. Because I think at the time I wasn't looking like I was going to get a great OP or something. And so I think I was lucky enough that it was like a holiday course at like one of the graphic design colleges in Brisbane about just prior to my last year. And so I did that, and it just all clicked. It's like, oh, cool. These people are interested in art and design, and I can get paid for making things like logos and art and advertising and that sort of stuff. And it seemed a little bit more concrete at the time than just like, I would have loved to have gone off and done fine arts, but I think even I needed to know exactly where the through line was of how I would get paid for doing this. Whereas fine arts, a lot of it is just that hope and a prayer of like, this is going to pay off, I hope, or I'll take it in some other direction. But yeah, I was lucky enough to get into this course. I think it was like a folio application, and I got in about 6 months prior to finishing year 12. And I think that from that point on, I was just like, okay, I'm done. I don't think I cared about another assignment after that. I'd love to see like all my stats of all my further tests where they came in. But yeah, no, I got into that being like, okay, this is what I'm good at. This is what I like. Still no idea that games as an industry or career even existed. And it was only because through the course, I started bringing home all the software and the packaging. Like we started doing a little bit of 3D stuff related to like a wine bottle packaging design assignment. And meanwhile, my brother, he'd taken a slightly different, he's 5 years younger. He was a homeschool kid. He decided he was out, I think in year 9, he's like, I'm just going to do homeschool. And I would bring all the software home and be like, here, you can play with this. And a homeschool kid is going to have all the time in the world to throw himself into 3D packages and that sort of thing. So he was actually the one who got heavily into games or interested in games being an option, started doing 3D stuff. Like we were using like the early Pixar beta versions of Lightwave and like all this really clunky old 3D, like, what was it? I had the original 3D program that all those 90s, like the Regurgitator film clips and all that stuff was built in. I forget what it was, but it had a very obvious aesthetic of like base geometry and that same sort of shading. And we were playing around with all that stuff. So I graduated in 98. I think the iMac was launched maybe the end of 98, 99. I was one of the first years of design college where they actually let us use computers within the first couple of months. Up to that point, it was they had strict rules of like, oh, the first year you're only going to do letterpress and you're only going to do like the original practical sort of skills. And ours was the first generation where they're like, oh, they might actually need to know how to use computers from the get-go. So I would bring, it was one of the original lime green G3 iMacs. I'd strap it to the front seat of my car, bring it to school every day, do my work on it at school, strap it to the car, drive it home. But that was another cool situation, kind of like the basketball court in Hong Kong where all these kids were locked up playing Game Boys. We were a bunch of design students, and it was at this rebirth of the Mac where the new G3s and were actually decent. Like they could play games again. Up to that point, the last couple of years, Mac couldn't really play games, and developers were actually porting stuff to Mac, at least the big ones. So you get like your Unreal Tournament and all those sorts of games. But there was one game that we'd play locally, and it would just get in everyone's head, and it was the Carmageddon series. And the first one, I remember it got a lot of press. It was kind of in that era of like, oh my God, how can they do that? The objective is to run over people in this game, and it was kind of like this shock marketing. But the actual core of the game was actually a really decently fun combat racing game. And it had a lot of humor behind it. Like there was a lot of really sort of dark satire. I think a lot better than just, there was a lot of, there was really bad examples of things like Postal and stuff like that. But within Carmageddon, underneath the like juvenile nature of some of it, there was like some really cool racing mechanics and stuff. And we'd play it within the design college after hours, and there was all like either race modes or like like you have to hunt down other cars and last remaining players, sort of destruction derby style things. And I think Carmageddon 2 was the first one where the graphics didn't look they didn't have to go the full stylized route. They were actually starting to go some of the 3D stuff. So I think visually it maybe hasn't aged as nicely as the first one did. But just the car designs were so iconic, and the power-ups in that game were fantastic.
You're right about that period of like dark and nasty controversial games, like the Postal series, Manhunt, Carmageddon. Like I think today those games would be, I mean, we have indie horror games which can be quite full on, but I feel these games were really zeitgeisty in terms of how they were shared and how they were played. Like it was a different cultural impact. um yeah.
And I think they were definitely the sort of games where the bullet points on paper scared the crap out of censors and people who were sensitive to that kind of thing. But when you actually played them, or at least for Carmageddon, it was pretty bad in some instances. I'm thinking back now. But there was always tongue in cheek. There was always a bit of humor there, and that kind of plays up later in my career. That I end up working with one of the people who developed that game, who you and I both know, and it fills in a lot of the gaps now I know about the studio and know about their culture. They were very much making a game for them. They weren't trying to be controversial. They weren't trying to court controversy or anything like that. It was much more, if they found it funny, it was in the game. And I think that the experience of playing it, that's what translates, is it's like, oh, this is fun. And there's a reason within this crazy world that this is there, and it's not purely for shock value. Whereas I think a lot of those other games like Postal and other things around that time, they were purely for shock, and I think that's the difference there. Yeah.
I'm going to go back a little bit to you being at design school, because we're around the same age, and so like I finished studying in 2000, and I studied electronic design, interactive multimedia, and that was a bit of game design, a bit of UI design, 2 years of Lightwave, like a bit of stuff. But I did it not to make games. Like I wanted to go and make short films and installations, and I was doing a lot of like VJing at the time and like all this other stuff, everything but games. But I completely remember the kind of colored Jelly Max, and I remember LAN parties, and I remember all of these like elements. And like my first gig I ever went to was Regurgitator, so very much like in the visuals of that space.
That
and
era.
it was a very different time in terms of how people play games and the relationship to art and the art of making digital art. It was a very different period.
Yeah, it was the first wave, I think, where a lot of that stuff became accessible, which is funny because it was still very expensive back then. You'd have to pirate a lot of it. Like there was no student licenses and that sort of thing. But yeah, it was something, that thing of like, oh, my friend's got so-and-so's brother has a digital camera. I've got a computer. I can edit it. I'll make you a video clip. Like that hadn't existed like that. The fact that CD burners and DVD burners had just come out, like you could print this physical thing and give it to your friends, and that didn't exist prior to that. And that all came about over that like 3-year period. Like I graduated 2000 as well. So like in that, I'd started design college in end of 90 or in 98 and graduated beginning of 2000. And that was, a lot changed in those 2 years. Like even just the technology. Like I remember we started out with zip disks, and by the end, everyone had burnt DVDs and stuff. It was a big era. Whereas I think a lot of that technology got a bit more settled and didn't jump as much for the next couple of years.
I think because of that rounded kind of training with that software, because it wasn't settled. So you're doing bits and pieces of, Macromedia Shockwave, or you're learning Flash, right? Action script, or you are, shooting films and editing in Final Cut, and you have this mixed media approach about anything is possible, and I can literally do anything. For me in my career, like I can trace that mentality. Like I'm pretty much the same person now. Like, as you probably know, right? I can do a bit of that. I can do this. I can do that. And I think I sometimes have to stop myself and pull myself back. I'm like, just like, you don't
Let me
have to.
do
It
one
doesn't work
thing
that
well.
way.
Yeah, rather
But
than
I blame my education of like all that era of possibility, because that's
ah,
kind of how I was educated. And by the
yeah,
sounds of it, you were educated in a similar way.
very, very much so. And yeah, I'd have to think like definitely like lecturers at the time. There's a guy I still keep in touch with, Brent Airy. He would do a lot of, he'd just come in with like, oh, I've got this new piece of software. I've learned this. And y- you could, the fact that we had teachers who were still learning as well, I think helped. Um, yeah, you don't, I talk to students these days and sometimes they'll be like, you'll be like, oh, have you used Unreal Engine? And they're like, oh no, our teacher just only knows how to use Unity or something. That's like, I think that's a dangerous spot to be in. Like there's so much stuff out there. And if you're not using everything or at least exposed to how it works, um, you, you'll suddenly there'll be a rude reawakening when you're changing studios or you got to re-skill up in a certain area. The benefit these days is I think relearning new stuff is a lot easier because there's established systems and like thought processes that come to like to design and 3D. Whereas back then there was so many like the Macromedia direction versus the Adobe direction versus like everything was so different that you couldn't really take what you knew in one and help yourself in the other because it was all everything was going in a different direction at once. Um,
I think the investment, like I was a shockwave master, and I didn't invest all this time and actually went back and did sessional teaching after I'd finished teaching shockwave, right?
yeah,
And now it's just, I mean, Flash, right? Action script
yeah,
and
yeah.
looking at even like influential creative figures in that time, like Joshua Davis, who had
Oh, 100%.
PlayStation,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. I've got the
His stuff was
PlayStation thing in my room.
incredible, right? And I mean, he's still around doing, I think he does a lot of kind of Web3 art stuff these
Yeah,
days as an
yeah,
evolution. But thinking back around like the people who were really innovating in that space and realizing that the platforms they were innovating on are just like gone,
yeah.
is incredible.
Yeah, yeah. Like I look back, I remember, yeah, Joshua Davis specifically. There was at like a design conference, and it was blowing my mind because he'd done. I think it was the first time I'd seen procedurally generated, curated content where he was doing. I think it was basically. It's probably pretty primitive. It was like a script running in through Illustrator that had a collection of shapes and colors, and he could tweak it to like auto generate stuff. But this was like 2000 and early 2000s and like that is a lot of what he was sort of getting at then as part of what people like now putting forward of the merits of AI, what they're claiming is AI when it's actually more just curated algorithmic like design generated scripts. But at the time it was I remember a really exciting thing of like, oh wow, we can do that. Like I can define my style and then like reapply it in different ways or mass produce it. Yeah, it was interesting ideas to play around with it at that time.
It was true generative art before AI. Yeah, very cool. Um, what's next on your gaming journey?
Yeah, I think it was soon after. So yeah, I graduated design college. I took a job. I worked in the advertising industry for a couple of years, hated it. Um, uh, ended up getting a job at a DVD distributor. And that was kind of my first window into like, I'd done a little bit of web in between. I was now, oh, I can do the interactive menus and stuff for DVDs, which are very primitive. Like it was a step closer to games. At the same time, I moved in with my brother. He had just started work. He was an environment designer at Chrome, so in Brisbane. Um, and people may remember Chrome. They did Ty the Tasmanian Tiger. They did some of the Spyro games. He worked on. They did the PS2 releases of Force Unleashed and all that sort of era. But yeah, it was the PS2 era. We had a PS2, and it was kind of towards the end of the PS2 era. And I remember it was that fun thing of buying a console when all the cool games had already come out. You had your like pick of the litter. Everything was cheap, and there was so many good titles on PS2. But then right towards the end, Shadow of the Colossus came out, and that was, I think, speaking of a game that like scratched the itch for me, it was like what I imagined, like what I'd been chasing from when I originally played Zelda as a kid. Like that sort of like there's this open world, it's fantasy, there's something I can discover here, and it was that, but with no hand holding. Like it chucks you in. Like the design intention is that you will die, and you will die a lot, and it's up to you to figure it out, because for those who don't know, you move through the game. It's basically a series of boss fights. Each boss is like a giant or some kind of like Colossus figure, and as you find them, part of it is figuring out how to get to them, how to get on them, how to attack them. There's a lot of really beautiful things in that game that it doesn't do that make it so special. Like the fact that you instantly, like everyone who plays it, there's this satisfaction of being able to take down this big thing, but then that you also feel guilty. Like without being too on the nose, they kind of constantly infer that, like, or let you realize that, like, maybe I'm the bad guy in this. Like maybe I shouldn't be harming this thing. Like most of the monsters don't bother you until you go up and get in their space. Yeah, it was one of the first games, I think, that kind of made me challenge a lot of my thinking as to what games can do from a storytelling perspective. Yeah, just from the experience. There weren't any words. Wasn't all there was very minimal words and stuff it would say. It was just experiencing something and feeling something.
And I think, games like Elden Ring are very experiential as well, where they're not kind of hand feeding you a story and you piece it together. But I find Shadow of the Colossus is such a existential and spiritual experience, mixed with some of the most frustrating gameplay you will ever experience.
I was going to get to that. Yeah. So I recently wanted I pulled out the collector's edition on PS3, and I thought, oh, my son's going to love this. And then within about 5 seconds of picking it up, I'm like, oh, these controls are so, because especially now, he came to it looking at it being like, okay, it's going to control like Zelda, and it does not control like Zelda or Wind Waker. Like you have to fight those controls, and I feel that's the one thing that if the controls could be tweaked, yeah, as far as a modern experience now, comparing it, that's the thing that dates it. Visually, still looks fantastic. Like sound wise, everything else feels like really amazing. But yeah, if going back to those controls again, just that was punishing. Yeah.
And then from memory, along with the frustration, you've got the sound of the wind kind of breathing, and just like the frustrated pants of the character, like holding on for dear life as it's like climbing up this creature, and then you drop, and it's it's incredible.
And as much as I like the fact that it didn't like fully handhold you and be like, oh, here, this is how this mechanic works, or this is how this works. I played through it the first time not knowing I could kill the lizards and do all those other things to regain stamina and grow my character. So like my first experience was so hard and so brutal, and it didn't have to be. There's definite there's things to take away from that, but there's also things not to take away from it that I'm glad we've kind of progressed from, and and now we can have other experiences like Zelda and Breath of the Wild.
Yeah. Speaking of storytelling in games, I think this is a good segue potentially to your next title.
Yes. Yeah. So this is probably combination of like the feelings that I started feeling when I was playing Shadow of the Colossus. It's like, oh, you can do things with games and experience different things. The game on the 360 that I think really set the tone for that for me was the original Bioshock. And I'll kind of speak to it on, this is me dropping names, but many years later from being a fan, I ended up working with Ken at Ghost Story. I worked with a lot of the people who worked on the original Bioshock. Sean, very good friend of mine, Sean Robertson. And I've got a huge respect for everyone on that team. But yeah, my first experience of it as a fan was not, it was one game, I think at the time, I'm not sure how they originally marketed it, but I remember going in not realizing what it actually was. Like I went in with no preconceptions. I hadn't seen any, I think they were quite controlled with the footage that they put out. So everything was kind of a surprise to me. Like the whole onboarding sequence with the moving through Rapture for the first time and learning about the plasmids and the powers and coming across like your first enemies. That was literally, everything was fresh to me. And in hindsight, I remember I couldn't really put a finger on what I really like. I love the storytelling. I love the acting in it. I think it's hard to talk about or not talk about like the twist. Like I think getting that twist the first time, the conceit of why do we do things in games? Why do we just follow what the narrator says? Like, is the narrator really a narrator? Are we acting on free will, or are we just the product of the situation we've been put in? The fact that it played with all those little things and had those twists, that was like icing on the cake. But in reality, that initial experience was just so well polished, and it makes sense having known that team and known what happened in the development of that game. They basically went back, I think, and polished the shit out of that first opening sequence. And part of Ken's strengths is he's really good at tweaking an experience. Like he's as much an experienced designer I've met as far as like a creative director who thinks about it more than just the story. Like he wants the experience to teach you the things you need to know. He doesn't want to have to fall back on pop-ups or descriptions or things like that. So that there was a lot that I ended up learning from that, but from playing it the first time, it was like, oh, this is just such a polished experience. The story works with the mechanics, and you come away from it with a really, really satisfying through line of you take something, you take away from the experience a thought, and you keep thinking about it even when you put it down. I think like a good film or something where it just gets in your head, where you're like, oh, you'll come away thinking about the choices in the film. With this, you're thinking about the choices you made in the game, choices of like, well, what other options were there? What other things could I have done? And it was really nice knowing that a lot of that stuff was intentional on the designer's parts. And
yeah, I mean, I think Bioshock embodies world building. Like when you talk about world building in games and people are like, oh, world building and characters. I mean, Bioshock feels like everything was just thought of and rendered with such loving care. And then you had this incredible storytelling with the twist that you mentioned that is experienced in such a way. And there's ideas behind it all about control that I think my favorite thing about playing Bioshock and its sequels was when you encounter enemies, there's the foreshadowing of them where you can hear them and see their silhouette. and the menace. And then when they come at you out of absolutely nowhere. So it has a horror bent to it. And it's done with such great intent and great music, and such a contrast of the kind of moody kind of, I guess, like 20s to 40s standards from
Yeah.
memory,
Yeah.
but contrasting that with the horror and the clang and everything about. I mean, it is such a.
I'm gonna drop one of the cliche, or not cliches, but at working with anyone from Irrational or Ghost Story, the term mise en scène, like the environmental storytelling, there's nothing placed in those games that doesn't have a backstory, that like you can't, no level designer or environment artist is going to get away with just putting something there just because. There has to be a reason, and that environmental storytelling kind of helps with that there was so much thought put into, well, what happened here, like who came through here, what was someone living here, did someone die here, like that you were absorbing that storytelling at every part of the moving through Rapture. And I think that's also such a subconscious thing where you're taking that in, but you're not necessarily realizing it. Like you're starting to think, oh, something's not quite right here, or something's going to happen, and then the audio kicks in, and then the characters and everything else adds on top of that. So yeah, I think it's they're very, very much about what is the story, what are we trying to tell, and I think it shows through all their content. Also, having worked with the team, that game is so good because of some of the things they chose not to do and some of the things they took out. They had the number of, you'll find it on the internet, there's a lot of rough versions of what the Little Sisters could have been, and I don't think they, for better or worse, I think they made the right call in the end, but there's a lot of, they weren't afraid to throw the baby out with the bathwater till they got the actual right thing in the end. And that's a very privileged spot to be in, where you're at a studio and you have a publisher who gives you the time and the space. But they kind of like earned that at that point. And shout out to the big name who never gets mentioned with that series, John Che, who was actually an Australian, who he was basically, don't know, I'm going to butcher it. My understanding, he was basically lead game designer. He was like Ken's yin to Ken's yang. He did a lot of the mechanical design behind that game, and so all the tight polishing and the fact that it felt so approachable, that a lot of that is on him. And he's also a part of the Australian games industry. He's based in Canberra, runs Blue Manchu Games. My brother, funnily enough, now works with them and has worked on them. They released Void Bastards. They do a lot of really great, really tight, really well-designed games. And yeah, he's just one of those people who I think people in the industry who have worked with him realize like what a sort of household name he should be. But then he's also, personality-wise, the last person who's going to step up to a mic and speak to what he thinks he should be known for. But yeah,
I mean, movies, games, it takes a village, and these people that really contribute to make experiences what they are, and put, all the hours, late nights, iterations in. Yeah, absolutely. And shout out to Void Bastards as well for some incredible, indie game.
I'll check out Wild Bastards, the sequel that's out now. There you go, Dean. I've done your plug.
All right, moving on to something completely different, I would say.
Yeah, so it was probably around this stage was when I'd finally, it was just prior to 2008 or late 2008, I decided that was it. I didn't want to be in the DVD distribution industry anymore. I was going to move to Melbourne and I was going to update my skill set. I found a course through Afters, the Australian Film and Television School, that was like, it was the first course I'd ever seen that listed UI in the course description, but it was like applied multimedia graphics user interface. It was, I think it abbreviated to MOGRM or something. It was a mouthful. Anyway, it was only a 6-month course. You needed prior design experience, and it was basically, for me, I was like, oh great, this will upskill me on whatever stuff I need for UI right now, and I can sort of go from this course and then start applying to game studios, and there was a lot more game studios at that point in Melbourne than there were in Brisbane. So I made the move, did the course. While doing the course, the lecturer, Toshka Irving, who was a fantastically talented, or is a fantastically talented motion graphics and interface designer. She had organized that she was currently working at Blue Tongue Studios, and so she said, okay, we'll bring a bunch of the students in. They can meet the game studio and chat to the art director about the current game they had in development there. So I was like, perfect, this is great. And I think I was the only one in that course who was really, I wanted to work in games. Everyone else was wanting to work in motion graphics and app design or other variations of it, but no one else was really set on games. So we went in for this meeting with the art director of Blue Tongue, and I think as he was presenting stuff, he was kind of getting like no buy-in from the rest of the people, and I suddenly, by the end, was coming out with verbal diarrhea of like, oh, I see the references to like Jet Set Radio, and his eyes lit up. I could see he's like, oh, this person actually knows games, and that ended up being Terry Lane, who both you and I worked with at EA, and was one of the original designers or artists on Carmageddon. He was famously did the red car that you saw on the cover with the big blade down the middle. That was one of his pieces of work. But at this stage, it was a beautiful kids game, or like kids/adults platformer in the Wii called The Blob. And the whole premise of this game was the color had been sucked out of the world. You were this amorphous blob who was bringing back color and life to the city through painting it. It was originally based on it was a student project from Utrecht in the Netherlands, and they had, after Blue Tongue, prior to this, they'd done the game Barnyard, on the ill-fated Barnyard movies, which, for those who don't know, you basically, let's just say there were cows in it that were boy cows, but they could shoot milk from their udders. There was a lot of things in that game that didn't make sense, but for them it was a great starting point, because they treated it, even though it was a licensed game, they're like, okay, let's do a collection of basically like GTA style mini games in this farm-based game, and they learnt a ton from that. So when after that THQ trusted them, and THQ said, hey, there's this student idea, would you like to take it? And so they started building The Blob 1. And yeah, it was about just after that was started that I met Terry. And then when at the end of this course, Toshka said, well, she was leaving there. She was leaving there, and she was working a bit more part-time. So basically a role had opened up, and I was lucky enough, I applied, I got in, and worked with her partner, Duncan Irving, and did, was lucky enough to learn how to make games and work on the Wii. And it was that very first iteration of the Wii before people really knew what the Wii could or couldn't do. So that was fun. And yeah, there was some amazing music in that game. Like I remember the John Guscott, music director, he had organized there was a local Melbourne band, the Bamboos, did a lot of it, but then there was I think at that time Megan Washington was in the Bamboos, so there's like her voice on a lot of the characters in there. Yeah, it was really, I couldn't have asked for a better first games experience, I think. Yeah, and they're games that I actually were fun to hand over to my kids when they started playing games the first time.
I really miss the Nintendo Wii. Like, I just think it was such a fun console. And then, the Bamboos have been kicking ass for so long, and consistently doing what they do and still going strong. My core memory about this game is getting it confused with Epic Mickey.
Yes,
yeah. Because Epic Mickey was Mickey Mouse recoloring a world.
I think Epic Mickey the Blob 1 came out, then Epic Mickey came out, then the Blob 2 came out. But yeah, there was definitely some overlap in marketing there, but yeah, no, it was a fun era. There was some interesting. There was a lot of really interesting non-Nintendo games that came out on the Wii that I think a lot of people forget. And it was before, just prior to the whole indie boom. So you were still getting some like interesting sort of like bigger games as well. In amongst all there was a bunch of really bad licensed stuff, but there was some interesting, interesting experiences on the Wii. Yeah, I think the next, going from a studio where I kind of had to do a lot of stuff myself on the Blob 2, it was just me and one other person, Alex Smiles, you also know. The next experience was going to Ubisoft my wife and I moved to Montreal. We went to Montreal for a job interview. It was too cold there. I ended up getting the job in Toronto. And that was a very interesting game. Got to work on, so it was Splinter Cell Blacklist. I was a big fan of Splinter Cell, the original Splinter Cell on Xbox. I was very interested in stealth games, and this was like I think from a visual storytelling perspective in the UI was they'd put together a real dream team. They'd hired a bunch of really good UI devs. I think there was about 6 of us. Well, was it 5 or 6 on the team, and then we also had our own engineers. Like when I look at the scale of that team, it was massive, and there's so much stuff we did because of that you wouldn't be able to justify in other design spaces. But yeah, it was a really cool game, and I really enjoyed the Spies vs. Mercs mechanics. That the props to the Montreal studio, they did a lot of the game design on that part. But it was kind of like my Goldilocks experience of like, I'd been at Blue Tongue was quite a small studio comparatively, and then Ubisoft was on the whole other end of things. Like, it was the first, I think when I started there, we maybe had about 300 people. When I left, it was just getting over 400. And I think nowadays it's like thousands in Toronto. So yeah, it was that something you don't recognize everyone, very different experience. But you still have access to a lot of power and as far as what you can develop with the team of people you're with. You lose some of that intricate nuance and control, but from a like taking big swings from a technical UI implementation standpoint, it was interesting. It was the last game I ever worked on that used Scaleform. So Scaleform was very much Flash action scripting kind of core, but then we manually had that rewritten by a lot of the engineers. So it was something that just wasn't feasible after that. But at that point, it was probably as far as you could take a Scaleform game.
I want to kind of also say that I interviewed I had training for a job in Montreal, and it was summer in Australia and it was winter in Montreal, and I felt like I nearly died. My jeans froze. I had like windburn.
Yeah.
So I feel your pain. Just to wrap up, if you had to kind of take one of these games as your definitive, as your one to put on that top shelf of the trophy room, what would you choose?
I think, all of these games have their flaws. I think for me, The Blob will always be special because it was my first game that I had my hands on, especially the Blob 2. I think the Blob 2, I had more of I had more ownership over the UI in that. The Blob 1, I was definitely assisting Duncan. He did a fantastic job, but the Blob 2 are kind of, I could, the mistakes were my mistakes. The wins were my wins.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was actually one of the first games I ever got my kids to play, and they loved it. It was in their top 3 until they played 4 games. So
Yeah.
But-
He's such a cool character. Like, he's so tangible as like he reminds me of like mid 2000s or even earlier, like Vinyl Toys. It's got that
Very
kind of
much,
really
yeah.
dynamic.
yeah, thank Terry Lane for that. That was pretty
Again,
much his
we could
obsession.
do a
His
whole
obsession.
podcast about Terry. In fact, I should go talk to Terry and have him
he'd be
on to talk
fantastic.
about games, because he is, truly incredible. But
Yeah,
it's such a great, it holds up.
yeah. No, it's visually stylized, and just really the themes of the game are kind of like about an oppressive a president who seizes power and sucks the life and variety out of the city and tries to enforce monoculture. Like yeah, that's slightly relevant for today.
Slightly.
So, yeah. No, yeah, I'm very, very proud of that game. Not perfect. There's lots of hand-holding things. Experience-wise, I'd improve it a lot if I was to do it over. But for what it was at the time, yeah, able to step away. I'm like, yeah, no, I'm proud of what we did.
Thanks so much for listening. You've been listening to Playlist, and this is a podcast produced by the 3000s with intro music by Sam Shepard and also produced by myself, Benjamin Dorr. If you would like updates on the show, you can follow us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with links in the show notes below. And if you would like more content, please remember to give us a follow or a subscribe on your chosen platform. We'll see you next time.